Japan up close.
My interest in Japan started from a very young age. I'd say as early as 5 years old. Um, I grew up in Southern California in the early 70s, and my mother was an art dealer, an artist, and had art from all over the world. And she had a collection of ukiyo-e prints that just captured my little girl imagination. She made my bed covers out of old kimono. And in nearby, there was even a sushi bar in the 1970s with Japanese surfers that used to make sushi. And in my little girl mind, Japan was my Disneyland. It was my fantasy world, and everything good in the world was Japanese. And in 1980, we moved to Northern California in San Francisco, and we had Japantown. And it had Kinokuniya bookstore. At that time, it had the Kokusai Eigakan, a movie theater that showed only Japanese film. It had udon shops, and so it continued to feed my interest in Japan. And unfortunately, my school didn't have any history from around the world that included Japan, so I'd have to investigate on my own from the library. And I started studying about the history of Japan. I learned about Article 9, and I thought, my God, this is a country that has renounced war. And it was the 1980s, it was the bubble era. So, Sony is buying Rockefeller Center and movie studios. And I just thought, wow, what a phenomenal country to have come out of World War II and be this cultural beacon as well as a leader of peace in the world. I started studying Japanese in high school, and then I'd never been to Japan at this point, just in my imagination. And I then went to college and studied Japanese history there. And then finally, upon graduation, by way of the JET program, the English training program, I moved to Fukui Prefecture. And I was in the south of Fukui, about a 2-3 hour drive from Kyoto. And I spent 2 years there in this little fishing village with nuclear power plants. And it was very interesting intersection of old and new and tradition and modern, and going to Kyoto every weekend. And the more I learned about this place, the more I fell in love, but the more I learned and the more I experienced, the more complicated my fantasy became. It became no longer a fantasy, but a reality. But my interest still held. And then when I came back from the JET program, I continued to study, and I went to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and studied economics, but with a focus on Japan. And now the bubble has burst, and we wanted to find out why. And I eventually landed at Columbia University to study modern Japanese history. And that's where I received my doctorate, working with Professor Carol Gluck and Professor Harry Haratunian. So in short, it was from early childhood and just built, got bigger and bigger and bigger. So I joined Japan Society last year. But it's an old organization. It's new to me in terms of working there, but it's been around since 1907. So it's a long history. It had its kind of second rebirth in 1952 with John D. Rockefeller, third's investment in it. And it has served as the preeminent gateway of understanding Japanese culture, art, language, all facets of Japan for New York audience and American audience. And it has a gallery, it has a phenomenal performing art space. And it's really, long before anime was big, long before sushi was ubiquitous, Japan Society was the entry point for many people interested in Japan. And to be a part of that history now is incredible. So Japanese American, certainly we have Japanese Americans on our board. We have Japanese American members. We have Japanese American audience, but it's really a US, Japan, Japan, US space. Though we take a lead in terms of providing teacher training materials on the Japanese American internment experience. We try and meet that divide. We had a very interesting webinar, for example, when I first started, about racial solidarity in the moment of Black Lives Matter, as well as anti-Asian hate crimes that have been prevalent, and what that means. So even though it's Japanese national, the Japanese American story is very essential to us. In terms of challenges, sure, there are many. When you are a US-based organization trying to encapsulate a diverse and multifaceted place, like a country, like a nation, you have to be very careful not to be reductivist. You have to be wary of not feeding into tropes. You have to create an authentic experience that people know that they're coming for something very real and recognizable for those people who are Japanese and those people who have gone to Japan. Appealing to a general audience who doesn't know anything, but they just know that they really like the food, and bringing them in so that they learn more, but also serving people who are like myself, who was a frequent visitor to Japan Society prior to joining, who knows something about Japan and wanted to see something bigger, deeper, richer. So that's a challenge. I'll finish by saying, because I can talk a long time about this particular issue because it's very interesting to me. This year, we are programming around a theme of doing a lot of programming around the theme of Okinawa, and to commemorate its reversion, the 50-year anniversary of its reversion to Japan from US occupation. And there's a really fascinating kind of intellectual challenge in that the general public doesn't know that much about Okinawa. And we have a responsibility to serve that general public so they know more. But, it's a complicated history. It's a complex history, not only in US-Japan relations, but within Japan. The idea of Okinawan sovereignty, distinct culture, and identity are key issues. So how do we present that to a public who might not know much, but should know more? It's always a challenge, but it's exciting. So thank you. So Art Across Borders, Japanese artists who were active in the United States before World War II. So kind of Meiji era to late Meiji era to Taisho to early Showa era Japanese artists, is about a pretty large group of Japanese nationals who moved to the United States for one reason or another. Most of them not to become artists. They didn't know about art. That wasn't their goal. They often came as laborers. And through a variety of circumstances, became capital A artists. So not as a hobby, but as professional artists. And what was really fascinating to me about them is I knew something about art, but I had never heard of any of these guys. And I focused in the book on 5 artists in particular who had shared experiences and very divergent ones. But most of them were incredibly successful in their lifetimes, but have been somewhat missed in American art history or US art history. When I go to Japan to do research, however, I found quite a few books on them and quite a few of their works in Japanese museums. And they weren't displayed in the American artists' rooms. They were included in modern art and shown among other modern Japanese artists. Now, what was interesting about these artists as well was they defied what we think of as typical Japanese art, or what you can think of in terms of a Japanese aesthetic. What do I mean by that? So woodblock prints, ukiyo-e prints, the calligraphic strokes, bamboo, cherry blossoms. I think we have a very strong idea of what Japanese art looks like and should look like. And anime and manga are creating a new version of that aesthetic. These guys, other than one of them, the 4 out of the 5 did not work in that tradition in any way. They were trained in the United States. They didn't know anything about Japanese art when they arrived. So I think it's an interesting question of how you classify them. Now, none of them could become US citizens prior to 1952, right? So they lived as Japanese nationals creating American art. And so does that make it Japanese art or does it make it American art? And does it matter? And recent historians have classified them as Asian American artists. But this category didn't exist when they were working. They wouldn't recognize themselves as that. They were legally prevented. But then one of the most famous of the group, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, he was included in the Museum of Modern Art of New York's exhibition in 1929 called 19 American Artists. Now, the curator got a lot of pushback from that. Like, how could you have Yasuo Kuniyoshi as an American artist? But he was included. So this idea of what makes a Japanese artist and what we expect of Japanese art was very much part of this book and this story. So in 2011, I was finishing my dissertation at Columbia when the triple disaster happened. And I was on my road to go into academia when I received a phone call from a colleague at SAIS, my graduate school, who was running the disaster relief program for an organization called AmeriCares. And AmeriCares had ample experience working in Haiti and Pakistan after disasters, but none in Japan. And I joined to basically go to the region, to the disaster region, and identify programmatic opportunities with the funds that we had raised. And I was based in Miyagi Prefecture. I had an office actually in Sendai for 4.5 years. But I was up and down the coast the entire time, working with very small grassroots organizations to large ones, all Japanese. And we focused on, it's just myself and 2 other people on the team. We did 100 different grants for different groups. Many of them started because of the disaster and are still in operations today. We focused on, after the emergency period of food and basics and that kind of distribution in the evacuation centers, then recovery was going to be the real challenge, and that's when the spotlight is often gone, the news cameras leave. But recovery from something like that was going to be a long slog. And my personal experience was that the place where I thought we could help the most and had the most need, and that was going to probably be really difficult, was in psychosocial care, helping people with survivor guilt, with depression, anxiety, loss, trauma. And there were limited resources to be able to help people with that. And we had to come up with a variety of methods to be able to help people. And that included garden therapy, art therapy, and one particularly powerful one that was active in Fukushima was working with a group called Photo Voice, which provided survivors with cameras to photograph their daily life. And then they would meet as a group and talk about what the significance of those images were. And then they would eventually display them to a general public and talk about them. And the talking about those images gave them a voice, and that was an act of catharsis. And one example was I saw a photograph taken in Fukushima of a persimmon tree. And the persimmon tree had no leaves, tons of fruit, and it was the surrounding environment was snow. That's weird. By the time the snow is there, the fruit is gone. So I was so confused by this image, and I was looking at it for a long time. And the woman who came up to me while I was looking at it, she was probably in her 70s, and said, "Oh, do you like this image?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm confused. Why is there so much fruit there?" And she started crying and said, "I'm so glad you noticed that. That's my family's persimmon tree. We can't pick the fruit anymore because it's contaminated." And so by then, you're right. By the time the snow comes, the persimmons would be gone. But in this case, we can't eat the fruit. So it was examples like that that were really powerful, and I think we did great work there.
Japan up close.